It's time to start. Um, so first of all, hi everyone. My name's Poppy, and I am very, very nervous. So if my voice is shaking or I stumble over my words, I'm sorry. I'm doing my best, but for the past week, I feel like I've been chased by very, very slow tigers. Um, so a disclaimer: since I have pretty severe ADHD that not even my meds can fully curb, this is more of a lecture than a straight up panel. If I don't want to start rambling, I have to stick to a script. So if you have a question that you want me specifically to address in this lecture, please put it in the questions channel. Basically, just think of me as your nervous substitute teacher who's very new at the job and doesn't quite know what he's doing, but is trying his best. Also, a content warning. I will be discussing both spiritual and psychological beliefs as if they're only beliefs. Neither will be treated as objectively real in this lecture, and they will be repeatedly referred to as theories, hypotheses, and just beliefs. If this upsets you, this is not the lecture for you, I'm sorry. There are lots of other great lectures to attend. Also, I use non-human and otherkin interchangeably here. I know there are otherkin who don't consider themselves non-human per se, and I know there are non-humans who don't consider themselves otherkin. But for the purpose of simplification, I'll treat them as synonyms. Also, I'll be using the word experience so much, I'm not sure it's even going to sound like a real word once we're finished. So you have been warned. The focus of this lecture has changed a bit since I started working on it. My earliest idea was to discuss the gray area between other links and kin types. In fact, one of my working titles was Gray Zones and Silver Linings. And I still plan on talking about this, though not in the way you might expect. I originally wanted to argue that those who found themselves in this gray area should be able to choose how they wanted to refer to their identity. But the more research and thinking I did, the more I realized that this would still leave a bunch of people torn and confused and wouldn't really solve any of the greater problems in our community. It also seems like such a water's wet statement with how the conversation has developed. And you know me, I'm only happy when I'm starting controversies. The non human community, as we know it, didn't always exist. And though we often say it has roots in the elven communities from the 70s, that's only half the truth. While the Elf Queen's daughters and related successors, such as the Silver Elves, are the earliest known organized non human communities, they're by far not the only pioneers. Because non human identifying people have always existed and our numbers have always been relatively small, some of us ended up grouping together without even being aware of the other groups that existed. And of course, all these independently formed groups ended up with their own cultures and traditions and philosophies. Mailing lists like the Elfenkind Digest were generally open for anyone to join and read, but they also weren't widely known or easy to stumble upon for folks who didn't already have an interest in kinds of spirituality and identification. This resulted in a culture where people's self-identification was generally respected, and they would only be questioned if they made extraordinary claims. Compare this with the news group all.horror.werewolves, which was open for anyone to access on Usenet, and which was originally created as just a place to discuss werewolf media. On all.horror.werewolves, the therians, or wares as it was back then, would frequently have to defend their existence against strangers who just found them by coincidence. This would lead to a culture more focused on appearing respectable, which in turn would lead to grilling of new members and shutdowns of fluffy, quote unquote, fluffy topics. Um, can someone tell me if there's a lot of lip smacking? Because I hear it in my own ears, but I'm not sure if it carries on over the microphone. Okay, great. I just get dry mouth when I'm nervous. um, so, there were other independent groups, such as Alt.Fan.Dragons, which was centered around dragons, of course, and the Always Believe, which was centered around unicorns. And these had their own cultures as well. For example, Alt-Fan-Dragons generally accepted dragons from modern fiction, which would not have been tolerated on old horror werewolves. The Silver Elves is another semi-independently evolved group of elves, fae, and similar beings that still exists to this day. They only represent a fraction of our community, but for today's discussion, I find their writings very illustrative. They've written about choice of identity on multiple levels. For starters, they believe a lot of elven spirits have actively chosen to incarnate into human bodies. Um, but more provocatively and much more interesting to me, they've stated multiple times that simply wanting to be an elf means that you are an elf. This is in contrast to the therian community on old horror werewolves, where there was a big focus on involuntary shifts and theorizing on why some people were born with an animal side. I think it's reasonable to assume this focus on involuntary experiences is due to the werewolf narrative itself, which the community stemmed from. In werewolf media, a person's wolfish side is rarely, if ever, a choice, while in New Age and spiritual communities, like that of the Silver Elves, there's a greater emphasis on choice of spirituality and subsequently on choice of identity. It wouldn't be right to say that every Therian back then shared the same idea, however. The idea that involuntary shifts are a core trait, I'm sorry. However, the idea that involuntary shifts are a core trait of their entropy does seem to persist in old horror werewolves user base. Nearly all introduction posts include a line about involuntary shifts. Another idea that repeats itself is that the Therian either had a sudden awakening or just always knew they were animalistic, contrasted with the Silver Elves' idea that simply wanting to be an elf is enough for you to be one. So that was a quick history. Any questions before I continue? Several people are typing. Oh God. I see one already. Do we count star seeds as non-human subculture? Kinda. It's complicated. Um, Star seeds haven't really overlapped with otherkin that much, but some definitely do consider themselves otherkin. Mm, no questions? Okay. There are two main ideas about origins that seem to persist in all of this. That one is either born non-human or the one becomes non-human. Both are equally true in their own way. The born this way narrative is quite a bit more common than the becoming narrative, though that's not to say that the idea of becoming non-human is rare or even all that controversial in most communities. With a few caveats, of course. The idea that one can become non-human tends to rest on the idea that what we become is outside our control. On the more metaphysical side of things, there are stories of people being spiritually transformed into an animal after encounters with an animal spirit, or of having a shard of a god put into them. And on the more mundane side, there are stories of imprinting on a species during early development, or of taking on the experiences of a character after being engrossed in a piece of media. Most people I've talked to don't have a problem with these ideas of becoming as something outside your control. What really gets people's goat is when someone describes specific choices they've made on their journey, which ultimately led to their non human identity. And this finally leads to the theme of the lecture after that ramble. The topic of choice itself and how we categorize others based on the perceived amount of choice or chance there's been in the development of their identity. Some questions I'll discuss include: what kind of choices do we have regarding our identities? What the heck does choice even mean in this context? And how does the idea of choice or lack of choice affect the way our community functions? There are many kinds of choices that we inarguably do make on our journey of self discovery. Probably the first universal choice is to undertake the journey and to seek out a non human community. And some choices that naturally follow include choice of labeling, i.e., whether we want to call ourselves otherkin, therian, fictionkin, non human, and so on, and the choice to accept or reject whatever feelings cause us to seek out a non human community in the first place. In this line of thinking, being otherkin is a choice. You choose to label yourself as otherkin. However, the feelings on which you base your identity, on which you base your decision to label yourself, are not a choice. The feelings that pushed you towards the community were already there. Another choice that follows pretty naturally in this line of thinking is the choice to strengthen whatever connections you already have. This is something I'm intimately familiar with, as I've been doing it since I awakened as a bison. Before I even became aware of my species identity, I knew I was non human. I'd been having simultaneous bison and null feelings for a few years, but I couldn't quite separate them, and had, without much introspection, decided that I must be some weird kind of wolf. And I think a lot of us with uncommon stereotypes have gone through a phase like that. However, one day I experienced a very strong flashing image that was basically a flashback of physically being a bison. And this vision was so vivid and tactile, I immediately knew what it meant. And for the next few weeks, I ignored every experience that wasn't quite bison nature and just examines the recognizable bovine feelings. This helped strengthen my bison identity, and in total, my questioning process only took about 2 months. Um, though I've settled in my identity as a bison and I'm comfortable referring to myself as a bison, I never quit reinforcing it. While I didn't create the original bison like feelings, I'm very conscious of the fact that I do choose to connect every trait to my bisonhood that I can. Whether I see the traits as a cause of my current bisonhood or a result of it, it doesn't really matter. Things like being stubborn, preferring physical fights over verbal ones, and even liking the taste of those bean boozled jelly beans that are supposed to taste like grass. All these traits that any human could have are things I connect to my identity as a bison. And believe it or not, I have experienced some pushback towards this idea from a few therian communities. A very common rebuttal I run into in introduction threads and grilling threads, which introduction threads should never be grilling threads, in my opinion, but that's another story. Um, a very common rebuttal to considering these kinds of traits part of your non human identity is, isn't that just a regular human thing? And I have so many problems with that question. I'm honestly not sure where to even begin. Yes, those traits are experienced by humans all the time. I think some of the only experiences in the community that regular humans don't experience are perhaps species dysphoria and shifting. But if your identity began and ended with having species dysphoria and experiencing shifts, it would hardly qualify as an identity. Treating an identity like just the sum of its parts, rather than a whole and complicated construct, is reductive, and it doesn't just hinder discussion, it stifles discussion. I don't know. Maybe I'm the odd one here, but my whole non human identity cannot be encompassed by my horn dysphoria and the fact that I sometimes feel more like a prey animal than an apex predator. My identity is so much more than that. It's how I view the world and how I view myself in relation to the world. It's how I react to things, what I like and dislike, and what I want out of my life. And when you envision an identity this way, as a way to describe who you are, rather than a summary of every individual thing you experience, you absolutely will see some overlap with humans, like it or not. Another reason I dislike the question, aren't those just human traits, is that it's often asked in communities where the consensus is that you were born non human and that your identity is somehow more real or quote unquote valid if it can be corroborated by childhood memories. While looking back at your childhood and seeing how your current identity might have formed or changed throughout the years can help you paint a picture of the identity as a whole. That kind of reminiscence should always be secondary to what you are currently experiencing. Your identity is not based on the fact that you played dog when you were a toddler. Pretty much every human child has played dog or been obsessed with cats or wished they were a dragon. It might be related to your current identity, but if those were your primary non human experiences, you would hardly consider yourself non human, nor would you find a home in the community. No, your identity is based on who and what you are right now and what you're experiencing in this moment. The validity of your identity should not be judged based on the number of times you pretended to be that creature in kindergarten. Your kin type should be determined based on your current experiences. And if your current experiences include things that humans can also go through, that should have no impact on the validity of your identity. It was a little bit of a tangent there, but I needed to get it out. Any questions? Get them out quick. Also remember that you can always post questions in the questions channel, which will make it a lot easier for me to find them. No questions? Great. Okay, back on topic. Hopefully, we can agree that there's no shame in strengthening your connections, reinforcing what traits you already have, and drawing connections between a non human identity and seemingly human traits, which is a nice segue into a statement that might ruffle a few feathers. Link types are typically based on pre existing traits that are reinforced to fit a certain narrative or ideal. A coping link or an other link is rarely, if ever, pulled out of thin air. You just can't craft an identity from nothing. Yeah, crazy, I know. This parallels the otherkin identities, which, as I mentioned earlier, are based on pre existing experiences and connections that one chooses to give a name and to strengthen. The process of becoming a linker usually starts with recognizing certain traits that one either wants or already has but wants to reinforce by focusing them through a link type. For example, wanting to become better at handling stress, something I could need. It can be difficult to accomplish on its own, but it's made a lot easier by thinking about what a specific character or animal would do in a stressful situation. But you can't just establish a connection to any given character. There needs to be a resonance between you and the link type. And if you don't already have that resonance with the character, it's impossible for you to craft an identity around them. And in that sense, you could very easily argue that there is an involuntary aspect to link types. Once the prospective linker has recognized a connection with a character, they will begin the process of reinforcing the identity, which can include anything from writing fanfics in first person to wearing clothes reminiscent of the character to asking people to treat you like the character. All things that an otherkin or fiction kind might do when first establishing their identity. A key trait of linking is that a link type should fade away once you stop reinforcing it. Link types are supposed to go away if you just ignore them and push them away long enough. They're built to be temporary. However, a significant number of linkers and former linkers have talked about their link type becoming an inseparable part of how they view themselves. Even the ones who might be able to force their link type away would at this point become completely different people if they did so. In other words, their link type has become an inherent part of who they are as a person. This integrality can appear regardless of how much effort they put into creating the link type in the first place, and regardless of how non existent the link type was before they created it. So, what I'm getting at is that some people describe creating an identity from scratch by their own choice, which later becomes an irreversibly ingrained part of them. It's an experience completely contrary to the idea that we're born non-human. And from now on, I'll refer to these people as linkers turned kitten. Sorry if that bugs you. There are a few regular rebuttals I've seen to this idea that linkers turned kin just had a late awakening, or perhaps that they felt compelled by their inner true species to seek out the identity, or even that they were actually born non human but just didn't realize it until later. All these rebuttals are disrespectful of the linker turned kin's experiences and their intelligence. And I won't even try to hide it, they make me angry. The rebuttals ride on the idea that the born this way idea of non human identities is a fact rather than just a very common belief. I know that for a lot of people, the born this way narrative rings true. I see you, and I'm not trying to invalidate your beliefs. Instead, I want you to acknowledge that others may not have the same belief as you. For several people in our community, otherkinity is an identity that develops in response to certain traits they have. For some, those traits are inherent, something they're born with. For others, they're traits that develop later in life or that were worked towards. And I want to argue that for some, these traits were expressly chosen. The reason these arguments against Linger-turned-kins make me so angry, aside from the fact that they're built on the idea that Lingers-turned-kin don't understand their own experiences, and the assumption that your idea of non-human identities trumps someone else's lived experience. Another reason the arguments make me so angry is that they prescribe more importance to the why than the how of our identity. When you define otherkin by the way our identity formed, you're basically saying that the cause of otherkinity is more important than the experience of otherkinity. Okay, I'm gonna take a drink. Any questions in the meantime? Oh, I see someone posted in the questions channel. Great. Mm, Is there a way for someone to prevent confusion about their kin type when they think about and try to figure it out? I don't know, man. It is confusing as hell. Um, the best thing I've found is just to keep a journal, either a digital journal or a physical journal, and try to parse through all your individual experiences one at a time, rather than focusing on trying to figure out your entire identity all at once. Okay. I have a question about this panel. How can you tell if a feeling or aspect of yourself is kin or therian related or just a normal human experience? Well, I think I went over that a bit. It doesn't really matter. If you feel like it is an important part of your identity as a whole, then you should be able to consider it a kin or therian related experience, regardless of whether human identified people experience it or not. Can you repeat the last sentence? Yeah, sorry. um, what I said was, when you define otherkin by the way our identity formed, you're basically saying that the cause of otherkinity is more important than the experience of otherkinity. So what I'm saying is that we care way too much about our origins and not at all about our current presence in the world, which is like the thesis statement of my panel. So keep that in the back of your minds. All right. Oh, one more. Would you say that labeling something that you feel connected slash related to as kin versus as kith slash hearted is a choice? Yeah, you could argue that definitely. Um, and it can be very, very hard to kind of draw a line between kin and kith. Um, I don't really have any tips for that. I'm sorry. It's something I've struggled with as well. Um, but again, try to keep a journal and parse through all your individual experiences until you've kind of gathered a full picture of it. All right, continuing. We can't talk about all of this without also exploring the community's animosity towards psychological beliefs. Through my years in the community, I feel like I've had to handhold some folks through the concept of religious tolerance. I remember a little over 4 years ago, someone on Tumblr asked me my opinion on fiction kind, and it would still be another 2 years before I had my own awakening. So my response was basically that I was fine with fiction kind, though I didn't understand their experiences, and the only way it could fit into my own worldview was as a psychological phenomenon. And even after my fiction kind awakening, the latter still holds true. My fiction kinity is primarily psychological. But but yeah, somehow my statement that I didn't believe fiction kinity was caused by past lives got twisted into me saying that fiction kind were all just role players. And rereading the whole debacle that ensued, this twisting of my words had very little or nothing to do with my own personal beliefs. Instead, it exposed a very widespread antipathy towards psychological otherkin. And reflecting on some of my other experiences with the community, I see it repeating itself. When I have talked about my current experiences as a null, my shifts and my flashbacks and my high read, people generally accept it without a second thought. But when I mention that I believe it's caused by various psychological phenomena, I have on multiple occasions been told that it must not be a real identity. Some people have even treated my parallel life as just an elaborate fantasy rather than something that's completely real to me, just because I believe it's caused by psychology rather than spirituality. I have word for word been told that there is no way I could identify as a non human or be another species than human without believing that I have a non human soul. A direct quote was, "To say I am Fae when you don't believe in Fae is illogical." And yeah, it's everywhere when you start looking for it. What I take from these kinds of responses is that a subset of people within our community take it for granted that whatever beliefs someone has about their origin, the origin of their identity, are objectively true, rather than understanding that our beliefs about our origins are just that, beliefs. Whatever conclusion we reached based on our experiences, whether that be reincarnation or imprinting or something else entirely, and no matter how much we believe in it, it will always be a belief and never a fact. I'm fully convinced that my bison identity is caused by past life, and that my null and Benten identities are caused by various psychological phenomena. But if that doesn't fit into someone else's worldview, they have all the right in the world to explain it away however they want. I have friends who believe my bison identity must be caused by something psychological, and I have friends who believe my null identity must be caused by something spiritual. That is their prerogative. It doesn't matter how people make sense of my non humanity, as long as they're respectful towards my own experiences with my identity and don't try to impose their beliefs on me. If you have to quietly believe that someone really has a fairy soul in order to accept that they're really a fae, so be it, as long as you don't try to deny the reality of their current identity. As long as you don't try to claim that they aren't really non human just because they have the quote unquote wrong beliefs about their origin. Okay, any questions? Mm-mm-mm. Nothing in the questions channel. Okay. There is another, more recent, and much more prominent example of the animosity towards psychological origin, otherkin, that comes to mind. I'll not mention the term itself for fear of people harassing its creator, and because I have had a lot of beef with its creator and promise not to mention their name. Um, for the purpose of this lecture, I'll refer to the concept as non human by birth, which is essentially its meaning. And if you know which word I'm talking about, I ask that you please don't mention it in the chat. If you absolutely need to know, you can DM me. Also, also, don't misunderstand this as me hating on people with past life or soul beliefs. Remember, my own bison identity is based on a soul from a past life. So, last year, a rather old community member on Tumblr coined the term separate from otherkin to refer specifically to those who believe they have a non human soul, which wouldn't be a problem in and of itself. After all, terms like anima fidem and cerebromalius have been around for half a decade with no issues. However, non human by birth is specifically described in its coining post as a quote unquote less bastardized alternative to the word otherkin. And what this post describes as less bastardized is spiritual experiences, and specifically those spiritual experiences that are based on soul transfers and reincarnation. So essentially, non human by birth defines all other beliefs as bastardizations of what otherkinity is supposed to be. All beliefs, including spiritual beliefs that aren't based on souls or past lives, psychological beliefs, beliefs of becoming non human, beliefs based on magic, neurological beliefs, and archetypal beliefs. None of these are quote unquote true otherkin according to the non human by birth concept. Also, no cipher, no one uses any mephitum and cerebrum malleus. They're way too long and hard to spell. No one uses them. Um, but yeah, the word non-human by birth thankfully never gained much traction off Tumblr, but I have seen individuals use it. And it always, without fail, makes me feel unwelcome and unwanted. Not because there's anything wrong with a strong belief in past lives or souls, but because those who choose to use that label specifically believe themselves to be the only true non humans in this community. Because the term itself is not based on a respectful individual belief, but on what its corner believes to be an objective fact. Because this subset of our community has an almost evangelical conviction that all non humans have non human souls, and those who don't have non human souls are not non human. And like I mentioned earlier, the cause of otherkinity can affect the experience a lot. That's why we have these discussions in the first place. We come together due to our similarities, and we try to understand each other and ourselves by discussing our differences. And this is exactly why proclaiming any version of non humanity as the one true kind of non humanity is so damaging. It completely stifles any exchange of ideas. It makes it impossible for us to understand our differences, and it leads to more and more narrowly defined subcommunities that all believe themselves to be more real than the others. To define is to limit, but we need some limitations. Otherwise, a dog is a cat and no words have meaning. But we need to be extremely careful where we want those limitations to be. Otherwise, we end up with a community where psychological otherkin are bastards, and only those who are born with non human souls are really non human. Just gonna check if there are any questions again. Nothing in the questions channel. Does anyone have anything they want me to answer real fast? Otherwise, I'm gonna continue. All right. The next thing I want to discuss is subjective truth. Subjective truth is one of the most important concepts to understand and really internalize if we want to have fruitful discussions and respectful experience sharing. In short, a subjective truth is something that is not real because it can be proven to exist through scientific measurements, but is instead real because a person experiences it as real. If I make the claim that tea tastes better than coffee, which it does, for example, you cannot refute that simply because you think coffee tastes better. We have to understand each other's experiences and accept that we experience the world in different ways. So, thus, it's equally true to say that coffee is better than tea and that tea is better than coffee. Both are equally true. And this is also what I was talking about at the very beginning when I said that the born this way narrative and the becoming narrative are both equally true. So, how does subjective truth apply to this discussion? A phenomenon in the community I'm sure we're all aware of is kin memories. And if you're somehow not aware of them, in short, they are images, episodes, sensory information, and similar experiences that are thought to stem from another life, usually a past life. Um, they have all the qualia of memory, except they didn't happen to the body currently recalling them. These experiences, though, are not restricted to those who believe their non humanity stems from a past life. They aren't even restricted to spiritual otherkin. Plenty of folks with psychological beliefs, mixed beliefs, and other beliefs report the exact same experience images, episodes, and sensory information that does not originate from this world or from this current life. For decades, there's been a lexical gap in the community to describe these memories that aren't really memories, which is where I can't avoid tooting my own horn a bit. Um, I have an extremely rich and detailed parallel life as an old from which I can quote unquote recall events, people, traditions, names, and so much more. And it's all integral to my non human identity. However, because I believe it all stems from some deep unconscious part of my brain, and because it feels like a parallel life, not a past life, I never felt right calling these things memories. So, almost 2 years ago at this point, I undertook the quest to fix that lexical gap. And after looking through dozens of obscure web pages and dictionaries and articles, I found something useful: the word noema. Noema is a rarely used Greek word that translates to a concept, idea, perception, or a thought. And I've been very happy to see the term catching on in my corner of the community, at least, where it's often used as a broader alternative to memory. No, it has not been 2 years since I coined it. It's been 1.5 years, but I started looking for it a half year before I published my findings, I guess. Um, so yeah, in philosophy, a noema is defined as the perceived as it is perceived. And at first, that might sound a bit vague or esoteric, but when looked at through the lens of subjective truth, it suddenly starts to make sense. A subjective truth is something that's real just because a person experiences it as real. A noema is the perceived as it is perceived. So when we're using noema as a substitute for memory, when we're discussing memory like experiences in the community, and we explicitly refer to them as noemata, instead of referring to them as memories, the actual cause of the noema is then irrelevant. The only thing that matters is that it's in one way or another perceived as a memory. When talking about noemata, it's completely and utterly irrelevant if they're real in any objective way. The only thing that matters is that the individual experiences the noema as real. Essentially, the word noema makes the cause irrelevant, so we can instead focus on the experience alone. And I think the fact that this word has caught on, at least on Tumblr, hints that our community might be moving in a positive direction. Because I at least dream of a community where we care a lot less about our origins and a lot more about our actual presence in the world. And I see there's been posted something in the questions channel. Great. Have you ever heard of the term Endel? Yes, I have heard of it. Um, I think I follow the corner. I'm not sure actually. There are a lot of people I think I follow, but then I realize I don't follow them. But Endel is a great term. Thumbs up. Something we were curious of. Is there a difference between noema and exomemory? Mm, kinda. It's complicated. Noema, I've well, I didn't coin the term, of course. The ancient Greeks did, but the way I appropriated the term for our community was intended to be as broad as possible. So standard past life memories would also be included as noemata, um, and exomemories as well. A noema is just everything that feels like a memory, basically. Or anything that doesn't really feel like a memory per se, like knowing, I don't know, the color of your fur, something that feels very basic, knowing that you had legs in another life, just any knowings count as noemata. Okay. um so I had a conversation with a friend a few months ago about this community-wide worry about the origins of our identity. And just to reiterate, I'm not saying your spiritual beliefs are irrelevant, because they can be really important when forming a whole picture of your identity. I'm more so saying that they can be a bit of a distraction. In my opinion, the whole discussion about spirituality versus psychology is a red herring. Most of us didn't seek out the community because we had a certain spiritual belief. We sought it out because we felt not quite non-human, and it was only later that we reached any conclusions about why we feel non-human. So my friend and I talked about the role this discussion of origins plays in our community, and we came up with a few interesting ideas. For starters, it is evidently very upsetting for some folks to have to earnestly consider the idea that reincarnated souls are no more real or valid than psychological imprinting, or in other non-spiritual belief for that matter. That's part of what started the whole non-human by birth idea I mentioned earlier. And it really seems like this uncomfortableness stems from a place of insecurity. Um, so at the risk of offending some folks, I'm gonna draw a parallel to the trans community. In the trans community, there's a discussion of origins that parallels the one in the kin community, and is likewise an attempt to draw lines between the quote unquote real trans people and the so called transgenders, which are supposed people who pretend to be trans for clout. Um, those who attempt to draw these lines proclaim that being trans is a medical condition that they wouldn't wish on their worst enemy, and one that's marked by intense dysphoria and stress. They'll also regularly state that being trans is only real or valid because it has been proven through MRI brain scans that some female assigned people have supposed male brains and vice versa. And just to make things clear, those brain scans are not real. It's malicious pseudoscience spread by people who want to cure transness by preventing trans kids from being born. But I think this attempt at validating your identity, in this case with science, stems from a dislike of one's own traits, or more likely from the outside world's dislike of those traits. When certain trans people try to prove themselves more valid than others in the eyes of the public, it's not because they just hate those they deem not trans enough. It's because they're afraid of being rejected by the rest of the world. Those people are basically saying, I didn't choose to be trans. This is how I was born. So you have to accept it because it's unchangeable. It's a cry for acceptance in an unaccepting world. And all this is not to say that some trans people aren't born trans. I really think most trans people have a narrative like that. Um, I'm more so trying to get across that someone else's narrative of choice should have no impact on your narrative of involuntarity. Both are real ways to experience this identity. And in many ways, having a narrative of choosing to be trans is necessary for the community because it closes the doors for eugenicists who would try to eliminate, quote unquote, the trans gene. Viewing transness as a purely medical phenomenon, where you need to meet certain requirements to get a trans diagnosis, is a really reductive way to look at identity. Like I mentioned earlier, an identity is not just the sum of its parts, and it cannot be summarized by being forced to feel dysphoria. The fact of the matter is that we don't know trans people are real because we have brain imaging technology, or even because certain people meet the medical criteria for having gender dysphoria. We know trans people are real because there are real people who identify as trans. We should trust that people are trans when they tell us they are, and I think we need to look at non human identities in the same way. And I see there is a question. Nice. Love questions. Um, okay, no question, but hi, baby dog. I love the word Endel. It's great. Thank you for coining it. Okay. Um, yeah. Before I move on to the conclusion, I want to explain just why this topic has become so important to me. A couple of months ago, after a good year or two of introspection, I realized I had created a heart type. Not a kin type, but nonetheless an equally integral part of how I view myself and engage with the world. And changing something so fundamental about myself sent my thoughts racing. So, when I was a kid, I picked up a fear of spiders. It wasn't bad enough to give me panic attacks, but it was bad enough that I couldn't pick up a spider and carry it outside, even though I could do that with pretty much any other bug. I was about 10 years old when I decided that this was dumb and that I wanted to change it. So as a tween, I started my own process of exposure therapy, by looking at photos of spiders and reading about them and photographing them in nature. And after several years, it had gotten to the point where I barely had a reaction to seeing them. Um, but as I continued on, getting used to the idea of holding them and touching them, something changed in me. Where I had previously felt fear, I started to feel admiration and love and a sense of familiarity. I wanted to surround myself with these animals. I wanted to work with them, and I started spending a not insignificant amount of money on terrariums for them. And now, after more than a decade of rewriting my own thoughts and changing a mild fear into a love so deep it affects my sense of identity itself, I feel confident saying I created a heart type. It was not an easy process. Like I said, it took more than a decade. Changing your entire mindset like that can't be done with just a snap of your fingers, but evidently some people are able to do it. Mm. Though I have to add that even here, it's very easy to argue that there was some level of involuntarity. I already had an emotional response to spiders when I was scared of them. I don't think I could form this kind of relationship with something I'm completely indifferent to, like, I don't know, a Toyota or a Marvel character. You can't really form a relationship with nothing. And I actually appreciate this argument because it really highlights just how confusing the entire concept of choice is and how it doesn't make sense to define ourselves by our lack of choice when we can't even define what counts as a choice. But yeah, realizing I created a heart type, an identity that at this time was considered involuntary. Realizing that I didn't just play a part in creating the identity, but that I did create it, period. It sent my mind spinning, and I couldn't stop thinking about what else might be possible. If I could create such love in myself, could I also do the opposite and tear down my own heart type and recreate the phobia? Not something I want to test, but I think I could. And which other identities could be created like this? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the creation process has no impact on the nature of the identity itself. And I ended up posting a really controversial thing on Tumblr. In hindsight, I understand why people got so pissed off about it, but I still stand by those thoughts. I'll read it to you in full here. Theoretically, I probably could force myself to not be otherkin, but it would take a decade or more, the way my heart type creation did, and it would require constant work through those years. However, I see no way I would benefit from that work the way I did when I unintentionally created a heart type in the process of getting rid of a phobia. It would just rid me of a part of myself that's intrinsic to how I recognize myself. That's not something I in any way want. And because I don't want it, and because the choice would have to happen continuously on a timescale I can barely comprehend, I couldn't make that choice in practicality. A very long and very complicated discussion came out of this post that I'd need a whole separate lecture to recap. But a few important ideas were developed, which I need to mention here. For starters, when discussing shadow work and the, sorry if I'm mispronouncing it, Jungian archetypes, Jasper, who you just saw in the Navigating the Community panel, um, accidentally coined the term ego alteration. Through that discussion, we ended up defining ego alteration as the process by which you proactively alter your conscious mind, your self perception, and your thought patterns. It's not something to be taken lightly, as you'll essentially be changing your sense of self by it. And it's also not something everyone has the ability, desire, or drive to do. To integrate something into your sense of self, or to remove something that's currently a part of your sense of self, is serious business. And like my heart type creation, is something that should be thought about on a decades long time scale. I don't have time to get in depth about it here, but to consciously change your identity and your sense of self is definitely possible for some folks. And it's nice to have a name for the concept. Something else that came of that discussion is my own thoughts about how we define otherkin. The most common definition I've seen is to identify wholly or partially as something non-human on a non-physical level by no choice of your own. And basically, I just suggest we drop the last bit. Okay. Okay. It's a bit more complicated than just deleting a few words. In order to drop the by no choice of your own bit without losing the meaning of otherkinity completely and letting kin for fun take over, we'd need to rethink the entire definition. Instead of defining otherkin by the amount of choice we had in the formation of our identity, I suggest we define otherkin by how integral our identities are to us. It was briefly mentioned in one of the other panels, though I forget which one, but a pretty big source of conflict is that kin for fun just don't understand the gravity of otherkin identities. If we define otherkinity as something that's inseparable from who we are as individuals, it would not only make it clear to kin for fun that this is, well, not for fun. It will also get around the problem of people who worry that their identities might be invalid because they have made certain choices. Your otherkinity is inherent, and by that I mean you would be a fundamentally different person if not for your kin type. At its most basic level, your kin type is what you recognize yourself to be. It's the kind you belong to rather than or in tandem with belonging to humankind. Your kin type is an intrinsic part of you, and even if you could get rid of it, it would fundamentally change who you are as a person. If you chose not to be otherkin, you would also choose not to be you. In that sense, I suppose otherkinity is involuntary in that you yourself couldn't choose not to be otherkin because as soon as you make that choice, you aren't you. Though you could also argue that it is a choice because you wake up every day and choose to be you. And thus, the topic of choice leaves us running around in circles like it always has. Being otherkin, being other kind, has never been about being forced to feel species dysphoria. It's about being of another kind. It's about knowing and recognizing humankind and accepting that in one way or another, that does not describe us. And all this is not to say that coping linking shouldn't be a concept, but we really need to rethink that as well. From the very few coping link writings that exist, one topic I've seen several times is the idea of coping links becoming inseparable from you. This is not the point of links. And those who do go through a change like that find themselves more at home in the kin community than the link community. I don't want to impose myself on linkers, but if we want to, sorry, I'm so tired. I don't want to impose myself on linkers. But if we want these two words to make sense and have a use, we need to redefine both. I suggest defining coping links and other links by their lack of integrality and their ability to be dropped when necessary. The line that has been drawn between otherkin and coping linkers doesn't help anyone as it is. There are far too many non-humans who straddle the line, who feel torn between either community, or who only call themselves linkers because they feel pressured to do so. There are far too many non-humans who don't feel like they have a community they can call home. So I'm going to propose a new and much more inclusive definition. To be otherkin is to identify as something non-human on an inherent or integral level, however you define those two words. There you go. Clean and simple. No more caveats or annoying nested sentences. So, any questions? Wow, can't believe I got through it. In the questions channel, have you heard of the little Albert mouse study? I haven't heard of that specific study in particular, but I have read quite a bit about operant conditioning and creating phobias. So that's partially why I'm sure I could make myself afraid of spiders again if I for some reason wanted to. Mm. This is probably a can of worms, so feel free to skip it if you like. But what do you think of the concept of kin types that are 100% or close to 100% voluntary, as in fully and integrally identifying as something, but doing so voluntarily? Yeah, okay, I'm gonna piss off a lot of the community with this, but we had a whole discussion about the term choicekin over on Tumblr and how it is just don't use the term, just call yourself otherkin. If you are an animal or if you're non-human in general on an integral level, the cause doesn't matter. If you experience being non-human, you are non-human. That's it. I yeah, I know I'm pissing off a very big subset of the community, but I really don't care if you believe you chose your identity 100% as long as you are non-human now. That's it. Mm, Choicekin is like stronger link type. Yeah, I guess, but mm, we have too many terms, I think, a bit. I at this point I think it's better to just redefine a few terms, like I argued. Um I think if you feel like your identity is integral to who you are as a person, that is the only requirement you need to meet in order to call yourself otherkin. Um, oh, there's a question in the other channel as well. Mm, question: Permit kin for fun can stop spreading anti-kin rhetoric and the other unsavory things they tend to do. Do you think they should be accepted as a part of the? Yeah, they're definitely alter human. Alter humanity encompasses so much more than we usually think about. Like transhumanists are alter human if they want to identify as alter human. That is, um, even like furry lifestylers or even just role players can consider themselves alter human. Alter humanity is any experience that falls outside the normal scope of humanity. So, kin for fun um, could definitely be considered alter human if they want to. And thanks everyone for all the compliments. Actually, I was thinking we have 2 minutes left. Does anyone want to come on the panel and say something? It's okay if you're shy. I've been very shy too. Yes, Paige, please. How do I let people in? Bum.
Surprise, I'm here now.
Hey, Paige.
Also, the Dragon Blaze has a request to speak. I don't know if you saw that, but they're right there.
I see it
Uh,
now.
as the accidental coiner of the term coping link, I would just like to say that I do really agree with everything Poppy has said today, and you guys can quote me on that. And that's all.
I also had a convo with a friend, actually right before the panel, who is coping link, but who said they didn't like the term or didn't like to use the term because it was originally coined out of exclusion, um, which is also very valid because, like you said, it was kind of an accidental creation, and
It
it
was
did.
completely accidental creation. When people say that I coined it with something in mind, I have to say, I didn't coin it with anything in mind because it came from an ask where someone said, "What other word would you suggest for the term coping kin?" So if you guys don't want to use coping link or don't find it relevant or think it's bullshit, that's totally valid. It was coined on accident. But I do agree with the idea that maybe we need to take in the whole voluntary, involuntary thing into perspective. And maybe the word should kind of be put down, except like on a larger scale where we try and force it on people, because that's not really useful.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Also,
okay,
real quick,
Colin.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
All right, cool. First off, I gotta say, human here, but questioning. So this panel has been big boost in confidence for me. It's like I'm at the stage where it's like I'm not entirely sure if I am like otherkin. Like I never even heard about this community. I never even thought about it or knew anything about it until a friend introduced me like a couple years ago. And then like about a year ago, I made my first persona. Yay. I just kind of started feeling a connection to it. Like, sure, yeah, everyone has a furry, everyone has, oh yeah, that's me. But in the sense of like, I kind of wanted to be it, but I don't have any of the like this full experiences. Like, oh no, I don't have wings.
Mm.
So for me, it's just kind of been like an am I otherkin, am I not? So
Yeah,
this panel,
I totally get that. But
yeah, this panel has. Yeah, go ahead.
also there are no requirements to being otherkin other than identifying as another species, no matter how you define identifying as.
Yeah.
So you don't need intense dysphoria and you don't need shifts or whatever just to reassure that part of your mind as well.
I used to have a similar problem myself where because I always thought that shifting was this like really dramatic thing for everyone and everyone goes for this like really dramatic experience. I thought I can't be otherkin because I don't have these like super dramatic earth shattering shifts. So
In
I
2
must
miles, I-405 north
oh
is on the left.
Sorry, GPS.
It's fine.
yeah, I used to think because I didn't have these like really typical shifty things. I mustn't count. You're just a favorite animal, you know? Yeah. So I was just sort of questioning for a bit longer. But I wanted to pop in because Paige was talking about the accidental coping link coining. And I was just like at the time I remember feeling actually like a little bit of dread. And I know Paige already knows this because I used to talk about it at the time, but yeah. I mean, there was this like an argument going on where someone felt like by having to call themselves coping link that they were having to break the immersion of like identifying as that particular creature because made it feel kind of shallow and like they were admitting to tricking themselves. And I kind of agreed with them on that because like I'm kind of like somewhere in the middle of voluntary and involuntary. Hang on, I've lost my train of thought now.
It's okay. Words are hard. That's
Yeah,
why I have a script.
yeah. Um, so like when the word was being coined, I was just thinking about the voluntary aspects that I have, and I was thinking, well, if half of my experience comes under coping link, then I'd also have to break the immersion, and you know, and so when the term was coined, I was sort of like really kind of dubious about it, but I don't really bring it up that much because I like Paige. I didn't want to upset
Yeah, of
Paige.
course, we all
Thanks,
like Paige.
Lapori.
But now Paige seems to be kind of I don't know changing their mind on some of it, and I'm kind of a bit more open about that disagreement I had. So darn you, Paige, for your accidental word.
Look, I just want to say that I have spent the last when was coping link coined 2016? So I spent the last
Probably.
like
Yeah,
what 5 years wondering
yeah.
if that accidental coining hurt the community more than it helped it.
I mean, it's
But
definitely helped some people. The
it's
people who actually
definitely
use it.
helped some people, but I also don't Sometimes I think about whether or not it's really driven a wedge between this whole voluntary, involuntary, and then the kind of sliding scale where, yeah, some people are completely involuntary, some people are completely voluntary, but then where does that leave kind of everybody else?
And
Mhm.
also, how the fuck do we define voluntary?
At this point, I've just
Yeah.
started taking people's words on it. If they say, it's a little bit of both, but I choose this word, I'm like, great for you. You know
Yeah.
yourself way better than I fucking do.
Yeah, same.
I know it's
Also, thank you for hosting this panel.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for letting me host a panel, everyone. Yes, that was about it. Thank you, everyone. It was great. And I think I've gotten over my fear of speaking in public. Thank you.